Welcome to the Messy City Podcast, where we talk with the people who design, plan, build, develop, or even just think about how to create beautiful, successful, and humane cities and towns. Let's learn from each other and create places we truly care about. Welcome back to the Messy City Podcast. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. My good buddy Aaron Lubeck a while ago, who does a lot of great work with the magazine Southern Urbanism, among many other things, tipped me off to the work of Eli Smith, who has an initiative through that is published occasionally in Southern Urbanism and also on his own Substack called the Faith-Based Housing Initiative. And it's really fascinating work in a whole lot of aspects. And so I'm really excited today to get Eli on the show and kind of dive into this a little bit more and find out what he's trying to accomplish with all this. So Eli, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. This has been Messy City Podcast has been kind of one of my outlets and one of my educational tools for the past few years. So I'm glad to be on it. It's very exciting that I've been listening for probably 2 years now, maybe or so. So this is an exciting thing to be here.
Well, my pleasure, and always glad to know people are listening. So that's cool. So let's start, Eli, a little bit by talking about who you are and what your background is. Are you actually an architect, or do you come from that world?
No, I'm not. So this is a funny story. I went to college and actually was studying religion, funnily enough. Mm-hmm. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life and went to a liberal arts school. I went to Dartmouth College up in New Hampshire, which was for me a big culture shock going up to kind of rural New Hampshire from where I grew up, which was Williamsburg, Virginia. So pretty big life change, but going to a liberal arts school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Thought I might want to become a lawyer, study government, that kind of thing. And figured out pretty quickly that wasn't the path for me, and stumbled into a religion course. And pretty quickly I was kind of taken by the whole religion department, a lot of the courses that they were offering. And it kind of, for me, it immediately stuck out as kind of this really interesting overlap of all these different disciplines. So, you get a good amount of philosophy and, the big hairy questions about the meaning of life. Right. Mm-hmm. But it also brings in a lot of like politics and government and history and archaeology and all of these other things as well. Right. And so I was studying religion for about 2 years, and about halfway through my sophomore year, a friend turned me on to strong towns, and pretty quickly I got deep into that world and started, reading all the strong town stuff, and then got into CNU and kind of fell head over heels for it, and realized that it was probably a better career path than whatever my religion degree was, where it was going, because I knew I didn't want to go into academia for religion. And for a while there, I was kind of uncertain about, like you asked if I'm an architect, and going to a liberal arts school where we didn't have any planning school. There's a geography department, but it wasn't really planning focused, and not really having that technical background or being an architect, I kind of didn't really know where my niche would fit in and how I could kind of get into this world. And actually, it was funnily enough that I got in touch with Aaron Lubeck, who you mentioned at the beginning, and ended up interning with Southern Urbanism. And he was the one that turned me on to this faith-based housing movement. And immediately it was like a light bulb went off in my head, and I realized that it was kind of the perfect intersection of all the different interests that I had been having that I thought were unrelated and that could actually be related.
Mm-hmm. And so then following your interests, like how does that translate into, are you working actively in the faith-based housing movement, or are you still kind of working more on academic side, or how do you fill your time?
Yeah. So that was about 2.5 years ago at this point that I got connected with Aaron, and he hired me on to kind of help out with this faith-based housing initiative, initially in a kind of research and writing capacity,
Mm-hmm.
while I was still at school. And thankfully, the religion department at Dartmouth allowed me to do a senior thesis where I was pretty much spent the entirety of my senior year doing independent study
Hmm.
about the faith-based housing movement. And pretty quickly into that research, I realized that there are not that many people actively thinking about this or writing about it or sharing any of the lessons. A lot of the case studies that I've come across have kind of been buried just because I think there's a dearth of local news and a dearth of lessons being shared, even like regionally, much less nationally. Um, so Aaron gave me the opportunity to publish via Substack, which was really great to kind of start that right before my senior year of college, and then turn that into kind of a full-time academic interest where I was spending basically, all of my time my senior year of college, interviewing folks all over the country about kind of different faith-based housing stuff going on, about legislation, about different case studies, and just diving really deeply into the history of it and reading a lot about it. And then coming out of my senior year, I graduated about a year ago now. And then Aaron hired me full time to run the FBHI. So turning a lot of those learnings into lessons that we can actually share with congregations that are doing this work. And so now with the faith-based housing initiative, a lot of our work is helping congregations through cohorts, regionally based, city-based cohorts, helping them to kind of look at their assets in a new light and imagine what housing could look like on that land and kind of reimagining it for the community.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about there's so much talk about housing. If you wanted to,
Yeah.
you could spend all of your life probably listening to podcasts just about housing and housing crisis and housing this and that. Why is there a faith-based housing movement or initiative at all? What's the reasoning? How would you describe what's the push behind it?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that for a little bit of background here, this faith-based housing movement has been happening for about the past 10 years or so. But it really gained steam during COVID and coming out of COVID. And so it's really taken off. I mean, it's a somewhat simple proposition, right? That there are faith-based organizations across the entire country who essentially have collected a lot of land through a variety of different methods over the decades and centuries that they've been around. And so, obviously there's, like you said, you could talk all day about the housing element. And I think that the simplest push is housing crisis and housing affordability. That a lot of these organizations are looking at that and trying to advocate for it, and then have kind of had this realization of looking inwards and saying, well, we have all this land. Could we do something with it rather than just, advocating or, partnering with other affordable housing organizations, right? I don't think that covers the entire story of what this movement is and why it's come up over the past few years. I think it's a good starting point to understand it, that it's come out of the housing crisis, but I think that you also have a number of other elements that have contributed. Primarily, I think that there's a faith crisis going on. A lot of faith organizations have kind of come to a head of confronting difficult questions about, maybe they're losing membership, or even if they're not, going through COVID and then coming out the other side of COVID. I think that there's a lot of questions of, even if we're thriving, even if we're growing, it's just clear that the way that religious organizations operated 20, 30, 40 years ago isn't really the best model for the future. And I think that with a lot of that discussion, there's been, how can we shift from being an organization that is only active on Sunday mornings for a few hours, or maybe, you have events during the week on weeknights here and there. But really, how do you shift to being a 7-day-a-week organization that is interacting with the community, 24/7, 365, right? And so I think that's been seen as a huge opportunity for tapping into that community element as well. And really ultimately getting down to this loneliness crisis, where I think that a lot of the religious organizations have kind of seen their communities fracturing and being very disconnected, and seeing their land as being something that has in some ways contributed to that oftentimes, through just not thinking of yourselves as a large real estate owner, and ignoring that asset. It doesn't really contribute to the town. And so I think that the good thing coming out of COVID is it's like you have these three things. You have the housing crisis, but then also this faith crisis, and then also this loneliness and community crisis. And all three of those things have really contributed to a lot of religious organizations across the country, asking these tough questions and doing a lot of great things about it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like if you kind of zoom out for a minute and think about the history of how churches have interacted with neighborhoods in our country, at least. There's been a lot of change. So you mentioned, obviously, there's just been a decline generally in a lot of churches, faith-based organizations, and my city is probably like a lot of cities where we've seen a lot of churches close or are very much struggling. So I think there's a lot of people aware of that, and but there's also been a real change in the nature of the relationship that neighborhoods and residents have towards churches. So 100 years ago, you essentially had cities were more or less divided by like ethnic neighborhoods, and each ethnic neighborhood had its church that people more or less walked to. So whether you were Polish Catholics or Germans, and maybe you were Lutheran or Catholics, or there were all sorts of ethnicities that sort of fed into the neighborhood church, and that model really has been largely disrupted. And now you have a model where people drive all over a city, they're almost like church shop to pick the church they want to go to. Or maybe they had an affiliation with a church when they were kids that they keep going to, even though they don't live in the area anymore. So it's fascinating that there's this wildly different relationship that we have with churches now than we used to have historically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that it's funny that you mentioned that, because that's actually something that's pretty well supported in academic literature as well. That a lot of the kind of downtown congregations, that you're absolutely right, that they used to be serving the neighborhood directly around them. Mm-hmm. And as we suburbanized and flattened out, a lot of the congregants moved out. And so you kind of had this really awkward relationship where those people would drive in on Sunday mornings, and they still felt tapped into the neighborhood because maybe their family used to live there. And so they still held some feeling towards that neighborhood, but wanted their parking lot and wanted easy access and wanted all of these things that in many ways contributed to the hollowing out of those neighborhoods. And then now I think that we've kind of reached this moment where a lot of those folks, those connections, people just aren't really willing to drive into the city anymore to get to that church anymore. And so there's almost like a need to reconstruct that parish relationship, which I think is super beneficial. And I mean, I think that the other thing that I'll note that I don't want folks to get confused about is that there are differing opinions on this, but a lot of the kind of opinions that I've seen and that I somewhat agree with is that it's not, building housing around your congregation is not a good way to revive the congregation, right? That if that's your kind of like last gasp for trying to build a neighborhood around yourself that's suddenly going to kind of revive and bring people back into pews on Sunday morning, that it doesn't always work. Sometimes it does. I've seen it be something that can be an outlet for that. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think that the core motivating factor should be serving the community. And even if the congregation stays the same size, that it can still live on through other means and still interact with the community and benefit the community through other means.
Yeah. And I mean, the question of like commuting to church from a longer distance is interesting to me because it's very much tied in with this initiative and this process about, land and what to do with it. It was one of the things that I've certainly come across is you have some churches that go through waves of like popularity. And So you might have a church in an older neighborhood that is quite popular, have a popular pastor or priest or whatever, and so all of a sudden they do drive for a huge parking demand, and so the
Hmm.
church buys a bunch of land for parking or tears down houses for parking.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
and then maybe that changes. Maybe that pastor, that priest moves on. Uh, Things change within the congregation, and all of a sudden you've got a church sitting on a whole bunch of land that is not exactly used. And so I would
Hmm.
imagine like this is one of the opportunities that you see occasionally as part of this initiative is to get some churches to think about maybe excess land that they bought thinking they need a lot of parking or for other uses over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the other interesting outlet. I mean, that you're absolutely right that that's definitely one of them, and I think that the parking lots can be, a huge portion of that. But you also have a lot of congregations that just, 50 years ago, somebody left a huge piece of land to them in their will, and so I've been somewhat surprised that it seems more and more I'm finding congregations that will just have like a random 10-acre parcel on the edge of town, um, because
Mm.
somebody in the 1960s left it to them, and there's not really a push to do anything with it, right? Because they're not taxed on it,
Mhm.
and they're not a real estate organization. They don't view themselves as being a real estate organization. They don't teach anything about real estate or development in seminary, right?
Hmm.
So oftentimes they keep it and then just kind of forget about it and let it sit there. Um, and it really does kind of bring up a huge question of how do you reassess that and get folks who are not real estate developers by nature, or not even kind of good organizationally set up to do real estate development, right? Because a lot of the committee structures can be very slow moving and not apt for real estate, right? In
Yeah.
so many different ways. Um, but I think that that's one of the questions that I really enjoy is how do you get people who are not doing this 9 to 5 for their entire careers involved in that and kind of excited and understanding the process.
Yeah. I think anybody who's ever worked with a church committee can know how painful a process it is to get a decision on just about anything. So,
Yeah.
what are some of the examples that you've seen of churches who have either thought about developing some of their land for housing or have actively undertaken a project?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that there are a bunch of different examples across the country, and I always like to tell folks that faith based housing is not really one thing. It's in my mind everything from tiny homes. There's a church down the street. We're based here in Durham, North Carolina. There's a church just down the street in Chapel Hill. It's called the Episcopal Church of the Advocate. And about 10 years ago, they built 3 tiny homes, and it was a fairly it was a drawn out process, right? And it took them a few years, but it was a fairly small scale project. I think it ended up coming in under $150,000, which they managed to raise in its entirety, so that they didn't have to take out any debt on that. Um, but I would say that that's definitely on the smaller scale end, and there are organizations doing that kind of tiny homework all across the country. Um, Folks might have heard of an organization called Settled in the St. Paul, Minnesota area that does a similar thing. A lot of those tiny home organizations are more geared towards folk coming out of homelessness,
Mm. Hmm.
and oftentimes have a lot of like other wraparound services as
Right.
well. Um, I think that you can then blow that to the exact opposite side of the spectrum, right? Which is these huge affordable housing complexes. Um, just 2 weeks ago, I was at one in Northern Virginia. That's exactly where you'd want it to be. It's right across the street from a metro station. I think I want to say it's 150 units of affordable housing. Um, but that's kind of the exact opposite end of the spectrum in terms of complexity and size and scale. I mean, I think it was over an $80 million project that took about a decade to complete, and had layers and layers and layers of subsidy and complexity and different partnerships involved to get that project to happen. Where my interest has lay mostly, and what a lot of the stuff that we do with the faith-based housing initiative is more focused on missing middle scale housing, which I think is kind of the next frontier of faith-based housing. I think that it kind of started in the larger apartment building world, and like especially in like Northern Virginia, some of those kind of rapidly urbanizing areas, and then has expanded into the tiny homes, and that was kind of the frontier about 5 years ago. And I think that where the next frontier is really getting into the missing middle range. And so we see actually here in North Carolina, I think that there are a lot of great examples, especially on the suburbs of Charlotte. There's a church called Newell Presbyterian that's building townhomes on their property. And I think that that's a really great example because you get a middle scale where with the tiny homes, with folks coming out of homelessness, there's a lot of wraparound services that are needed, right? And so there's a lot of extra complexity for the congregation to handle, and not a lot of congregations are really set up to do that.
Right.
With missing middle scale or like workforce housing scale, you don't need a lot of those wraparound services, and so it becomes a lot easier for congregations who might not have as deep of a bench of capacity to handle those more difficult cases, but they can still do something and still serve the community with that extra land. That example of Newell Presbyterian I also really like because in their kind of longer term plan is to also renovate some of the church spaces for other sorts of community spaces as well. I think one of their ideas is to do like a coffee shop or something in some of the existing facilities, and then hire out some of the like children from the neighborhood to work in the or like teenagers from the neighborhood to work in the coffee shop, that kind of thing, to where it becomes like a full complete neighborhood that has a mix of uses 7 days a week, right? Which I think is just a really incredibly inspiring example. And it's definitely kind of the next frontier. I mean, there are a number of other churches here in North Carolina that are doing similar things around townhomes, around cottage courts. Some of these, like a lot of the townhome ones, can be for sale and be sort of like a land trust model, promoting homeownership at an affordable rate. So there's any size and scale of the housing spectrum that you can imagine. It kind of also applies to the faith-based housing spectrum. And I think it's always really good to kind of tell people that and remind them that anything is possible, because I think that a lot of the conversations, immediately folks think, this land should be used for affordable housing because it's mission-based land, therefore it needs to be affordable. And it kind of immediately gets pigeonholed into the subsidy world, right? And that just pushes you in a direction, and then you're talking about compliance and not about mission. And so I kind of encourage folks to open their minds and think about it as a wider spectrum of options that, you can serve the neighborhood in many different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be affordable.
Yeah, I mean, there's an obvious linkage between a lot of churches trying to do mission-based, housing like that. I think there's one in my neighborhood where they have a building that has 4 or 6 residents who were women that I think actually were coming out of the penal system, and they were kind of providing like a transitional housing. I think the homeless example is a great one. I mean, my goodness, there's the model we have today is so terrible, and clustering housing solutions just has so obviously not worked. There's always been a part of me that's like, if every church could just more or less adopt one homeless individual in our city and house them and do something, it'd be incredible. But there's obviously I'm curious about some of the other people that you see. So I think part of what you're trying to say is they could just serve a regular market. They don't have to necessarily choose a mission related market, but there might be other mission related tenants or residents as well that they could serve.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that that's also it's a good way to kind of a good transition to also talk about a mix of uses as well, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that one of the elements, it's even if it's market rate, there's still their neighborhood still needs certain things, and so one of the congregations here in North Carolina that's working on for sale townhomes, they have already it's sort of like been a ladder of building confidence where they started their journey with renovating existing office space and renting it out to local entrepreneurs and local organizations as well. And that was sort of a ladder of like an easy, 6 month, you just renovate it and rent it out, right? It's not, the facility's already there. It's not that difficult of a project, right? And that built the confidence for them to then take the next step, which was getting more into the housing side of things. And now, that's going to be a much longer journey, obviously. And so I like those examples a lot because I think it creates almost like a ladder to step up, where each kind of incremental step allows you to do a little bit more for the neighborhood and doesn't necessarily involve going straight to a 50 unit development, right?
Right.
Um, and so one of our partners, Sarah Joy Prope, who we work with Faith Based Housing Initiative, she works a lot in the kind of placemaking world as well, and kind of expanding that lens outside of just housing into, maybe it's a community garden, maybe it's a basketball court, maybe it's a dog park. I've seen a lot of folks a lot of congregations do dog parks. So there are a lot of really kind of easy examples that you can do fairly quickly to turn that excess land into something that serves the neighborhood. And even that could be something temporary while you're on your way to a larger project.
So one of the things you mentioned earlier is that a lot of churches, in particular, are not really well set up to think about development and real estate development. And church committees are notoriously slow and difficult and painful. I'm not to say they're not worth it. It's just they're notoriously slow. And so, and so what are you seeing is like, how are some churches approaching this then to try to figure out how to successfully take on a project, or like you mentioned before, maybe they've already taken one on, they're looking to do another one.
Yeah. So I think it depends pretty heavily on the denomination, right? So there was actually a recent report that was put out by Rutgers, and actually one of my thesis advisors was the lead on that report, which showed that nationally the Catholic Church is pretty much the leader on faith-based housing, which is somewhat unsurprising, partially because they're such a top-down organization that kind of, if the bishop buys in, it's going to happen in a lot of cases. Not always, but if you can get a handful of folks on board, they can kind of unite and do something. Going from that being the most top-down hierarchical example down to like congregational churches where each one is going to be separate, and it's an entirely separate entity with different processes, different gatekeepers, and different people to sign off. And then I think that where the really interesting portion is kind of in the middle ground, where the United Methodists, the Presbyterians, to a lesser degree the Episcopalians, it's sort of a mix of the top down and bottom up. And so there's kind of a little bit of an awkward back and forth over, the congregations might want it, but then maybe the conference or the regional level, whatever they call it in each different denomination, might not want it, or vice versa, right? And so there's kind of a back and forth. I think that each of those individual denominations is sort of figuring out who the decision makers are a little bit as they go to a certain degree. I think that this is a new enough movement that a lot of the like processes and the decision making pipelines have not entirely been solidified for what happens when this comes along. That's not every denomination, and each even within individual like conferences or dioceses, like there can be differences, in both directions on that. I think that what's been really interesting is to see a few different examples of congregational churches that are sort of independently controlled by the congregation, getting more into this. I think it's harder to quantify because there's less unification in terms of like a denomination that's like organizing, and you can say, oh, it's the United Methodists across North Carolina are doing X, right? but I think it definitely does offer an interesting contrast to the more top down organizations, in that they do have a little bit more flexibility in many cases, and you do kind of need to convince fewer people, but also the individuals within the congregation can often have more power, right? And so there's kind of a trade off there.
What have you seen? Obviously, one of the things that a lot of churches would be concerned with was preserving like a tax exempt status. Is that something you've run across, like a concern that some churches start asking questions about? If we start developing land, does that threaten anything that we're doing, or how do we handle that?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and something that's been handled incredibly differently by every different jurisdiction across the country. There's been a lot of movement towards faith-based housing legislation, and oftentimes that legislation um, will kind of rule down that the housing element of the development is not tax exempt versus the like areas that are actually used for worship. It also depends on who that housing is for. So if it's market rate, if it's even workforce housing, oftentimes municipalities will say, and the states will say, that's not tax exempt. That's not considered tax exempt because it's regular market rate housing. Versus if it's all for folks coming out of homelessness, that can be counted as part of their like charitable status. Um, I think it's hard to say kind of writ large across the board because each one is entirely different. Oftentimes, the most common model that I have seen, especially with developer partnerships, is using the land lease model, where the church will retain the land, but usually rent it in a 50 or 99-year land lease to a development, often a nonprofit developer partner. And then whatever the tax rules that would apply to that nonprofit developer normally are what takes precedent. But again, it can be so different from municipality to municipality. And actually, I think that there's I can't remember if this got taken out or not, but there was recently a faith-based housing bill that passed in Virginia, and I believe that one of the provisions of that law was that these developments would not be tax exempt, and so they kind of just tried to clear that up front across the entire state.
Interesting. As part of your research and your work, how much have you looked at like historic examples too, not just here, but European examples, et cetera, of I mean, there's a fairly long tradition of faith-based housing. I actually just had Kobe Lefkowitz on here recently, and
Yeah.
one of his inspirations are the God's House buildings in Bruges, which were built
Yep.
by the church. But there's so many examples. How much have you looked at as an inspiration?
Yeah, so I actually did. I actually ended up doing an entire chapter on that in my thesis, because I think it's an incredibly important example. Um, Partially because I think that it sets a really great example for kind of what we can aspire to. Um, a lot of those, like the Godschwiesen in Belgium that you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, sometimes they're called the Hofias, and also the almshouses in England. Um, they're really just an incredibly beautiful place to live. And even to this day, oftentimes, when the Netherlands was going through their own form of urban renewal, it was not uncommon for them to pick up those god trees and move them elsewhere to save them from their own form of urban renewal because they were so beloved. And oftentimes, actually, a lot of those organizations that were set up in the 1600s have now actually sold those properties as because they're so sought after as these historic properties and historic homes, and built a new form of charitable housing elsewhere. Um, I also think that it's a really great example because of the small scale and the kind of community focused element of the way that those were set up. Um, they were very much locally based. So it kind of started in the 1500s around the English Reformation. The almshouse model started around then in England, and then that was sort of exported in the 1600s to the Netherlands and to Belgium. And essentially, a lot of those almshouses and hafiyas were set up by wealthy families who were local to a particular place, and they knew of a particular population that they wanted to help out, essentially. Um, and so, oftentimes, those would be older widows or older men. Sometimes they were set up by guilds who would, I think one of the most famous examples is a merchants guild of for essentially merchants who had lost a ship in on sea and then lost their entire fortune and were
Mm.
destitute. And so they set this up as kind of a last refuge to help members of the guild who had fallen on hard times and could live in this community. And they were set up around courtyards, um, oftentimes with a little chapel as well, which had some late medieval, early modern era requirements for around praying for the souls of the founders and that kind of thing. Um, but it essentially formed this little independent community outside of the city which was a refuge. And usually they didn't get much larger than 40 homes. Most of the almshouses in England were actually like 5 to 10 homes at
Mm.
most. And so really, I think that it's a great example because it shows forming a small community of folks, a little, as Ross Chapin would say, it's a pocket neighborhood, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a pocket neighborhood in the middle of Bruges.
Right.
Um, and that I think is a much more inspiring and enduring model than doing a big 5/1
Yeah.
apartment building that, maybe it's pegged to 60% AMI and it checks all the HUD requirements for this and that and the other, right? But like, are you going to want to live in that 300 years from now? I think that with the Hafias, the answer has clearly been yes, obviously, because people have been saving them. And I'm not sure that we can say that about affordable housing today. I think that one of the benefits of having a faith organization is that in many ways, they've been in the community for so long and have the ability to think long term. And not all of them, but a lot of them do, and they can serve the neighborhood. They can build something that has vision to last for generations. Um, and I think that that's one of the kind of biggest opportunities of this faith-based housing movement is that we can kind of recreate that model and bring it to the United States and build community.
Yeah, and I think to your point, a lot of churches and faith-based initiatives they don't feel the same sort of economic pressure that a developer might feel, where you got to make a
Mm-hmm.
return and make it like super quickly so that you can start to pay back your investors. I'm not saying there's no pressure, but
Yeah.
it's a very different pressure, and so it should allow for some flexibility to explore different development types, different community types, and anything that, especially like those smaller or middle scale projects, can really enhance that feeling of community that you described as lacking in a lot of places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think the other thing that you can get out of that for a lot of these religious organizations, a lot of folks like to say that they're land rich and cash poor.
Yeah, yeah,
They might own $4 million worth of real estate, but they have barely enough to pay the pastor, and then if the boiler breaks, they're going under.
yeah,
And if you reutilize that land with a long term goal in mind, it almost acts as a sort of endowment, right? And
yeah,
so the church can shore up its own finances and take a modest amount from that endowment, from that housing development to help itself and sustain itself over the long term and make sure that it's not relying on people on Sunday mornings for its entire lifetime, right? Because that's just not a sustainable model through hard times. Um, but at the same time, they can be charitable and serve the community, right? So it's somewhat of a win-win. But that requires long-term thinking. It requires
yeah,
having a vision for something that's going to last a long time and serve as that endowment.
yeah. And then if we want to get radical with it, there's the model that Monty Anderson and I have talked about here on the show, which he's explored a couple of times now in South Dallas, where the church just might sell the whole property to a developer and then lease back the sanctuary space so that essentially a developer would take control of a property and develop it all out. But the church then itself is freed of the burden of actually managing the real estate itself.
Yeah. I mean, that's not an uncommon model. I think that the danger there is that you get into like what a lot of denominations are doing, which is um, essentially just selling the real estate and running to try to pay off whatever
Right.
financial problems they might
Sure.
have, and so it becomes kind of an easy button. Um, and then in that model, you're not building a long term strategy, right?
Hmm.
There was a my friend Rick Reinhardt always likes to cite this as a good example that the Catholic diocese in Western New York around Buffalo was settling some lawsuits and ended up having to pay out a lot of money, rightfully so, I should add. But as part of that strategy, they had to make a lot of tough decisions and ended up deciding that they were going to dump about 90 churches on the
Mm-hmm.
market at the same time. So you can imagine, what are you going to do with 90 old churches
Mm-hmm.
on the real estate market at the same time? And they're not going to sell for top dollar.
Yeah.
It's not going to get reinvested in the community in any meaningful way. And who knows, how are people going to reuse that asset that's a very strange asset, right?
Right.
Um, and so I think that model that you mentioned, it really does have some benefits, but it can also be a dangerous kind of cop out in a certain sense
Yeah.
for congregations or denominations, especially, to not have to make tough decisions.
Yeah.
I think that the flip side to that, though, is that I was visiting a congregation in Richmond, Virginia, a few weeks ago, that had an old failing building. Their boiler went out. They couldn't maintain it. They are selling to a developer, but they're using the proceeds from that sale to a developer to go and find a new piece of land and then develop that themselves in a better way. So the plot that they were on was not going to be very good for affordable housing. It wasn't. There were a number of reasons that it didn't work. And so now they can take those proceeds and go and plant a different home with a lot of, like, I think that they've been discussing doing a coffee shop or a pay as you can restaurant, doing a lot of other things as well, and using that money to kind of seed themselves for a long term future in a new way.
Yeah. So, talk a little bit about how you, through the faith based housing initiative, how are you trying to work with churches in different parts of the country?
Yeah, so we have essentially it's a 6 month process that we run cohorts of five congregations, um, and through that process we onboard them and kind of make sure that they're ready to complete this process and understand it and learn about it. And but then day one, the essentially the first thing that we do is a design charrette. To draw out their site plans and do at least a very preliminary drawing. And so actually Thomas Dougherty, who I think works with Kobe Lefkowitz
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
is draws a lot of inspiration from those almshouses and hafias overseas. And so he's our lead on that, really designing with that kind of model in mind to build a really beautiful site plan and build really beautiful places. And then we essentially take that site plan and we stress test it. We work with the Incremental Development Alliance to do about a month long workshop with those congregations, working through pro formas, bank plans, helping them to build their actual development plan so that they understand the process. And as you know, with the Incremental Development Alliance, that they're a pretty incredible organization teaching folks about the basics of small scale real estate development. And I think it's apt because their mission and ours is kind of the same. As how do you take somebody who hasn't done this before and uh, teach them how to do it,
Hmm.
teach them how to feel comfortable doing it. And so we take them through that process. And essentially, congregations, that cohort of five congregations comes out of that 6 month process with a book that outlines their plans, that has really, really incredible site plans, and then also helps them to build the financial plans so that they understand where the funding gaps might be, so that they understand what kinds of investment they might need, what kinds of debt they might need for that project. And really, the goal is to get them ready to be the developer, with the recognition that they will probably, as most faith organizations that have done this work, will probably end up partnering with the developer.
Hmm.
Um, but ultimately they'll be able to speak that language and enter into those conversations from a place of confidence and knowing what the developer is going to want to see from them.
Yeah. And so I'd imagine this is like any denomination, anybody in any situation, more or less.
Yep, and of any faiths as well. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that a lot of being in the United States, it's mostly churches that are
Hmm.
doing this, but there are synagogues and mosques that are doing it as well.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about, like, is there a certain profile of either city or group of churches or anything else that I want to look for or that you'd like to talk with?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We're kind of best off with congregations that are maybe not in like downtown New York City, right?
Right.
That's oftentimes that's kind of a recipe for a big apartment building or a skyscraper, right? And we are more in the middle scale, so having a small amount of land, but being in the kind of the right market for a small cottage court or townhomes or that kind of thing is generally our sweet spot for what we're looking for. And that can really be, that can be anywhere in the country. And there are tons of places that are like that all across the country. Um, and so, I mean, and I think that the other thing that we generally look for is a congregation that is strong-willed and ready
Hmm.
to enter into those conversations, but doesn't yet know what they are doing and where they're headed with them. And that's kind of our sweet spot of uh, a lot of congregations have gone through like the discernment process, and they've laid out their different options that might be right for the congregation, but the real estate one is oftentimes the hairiest and the most uncertain. And so we can take those folks that know that they're interested and know that that's an underutilized asset, but they don't know what to do with it. And we take those folks through the process and kind of show them what their possibilities are.
Yeah. And I would imagine, in some scenarios, it's not just about having raw land available. You might have like an old school building or something that went with the church
Mm-hmm.
that's just not being used anymore or is about to close or something like that. So there's probably might be other forms of real estate associated with property.
Yeah, sure, absolutely, and that's definitely, I think, one of the reuse question is always a big one, and that's been a huge trend as well, is with the reuse of existing facilities. The other thing that I'll say is that so our cohorts are longer intensive cohorts are kind of our main offering, but we also do individualized site design and individualized consulting for individual congregations across the country, and so that is also an option as well. And folks can find that on our website.
Interesting. So when you are looking for like a cohort, a group in one city, is there sort of like a patron that helps pay for that, or all the churches kind of kick in to help pay for your time? How does that work?
Yeah, it's a combination. I mean, it's usually I think that usually we found that there needs to be some sort of support from a foundation or oftentimes the city that can be really helpful in kind of catalyzing that. That being said, there are a lot of congregations that are independently wealthy and have large endowments. And I've seen that. I mean, we've worked with situations where it was possible for a few congregations to kind of come together and sponsor our cohort. I've also seen outside of our individual activities that there is a lot of examples across the country of a wealthier congregation that might not have land. Maybe they're downtown. Maybe they have an old historic building that their hands are tied on and they can't really do anything with it, or they're fully utilizing it, but they have a large endowment and they can sponsor other churches that are have a better facilities for building housing. So I think that there's a really great opportunity there for cross municipality collaboration across different congregations, to kind of all work together and kind of pick which ones are going to be the best ones for housing.
So I think I mentioned at the top, you also have a Substack, and
Yes.
you're kind of routinely putting out articles on the Substack. Why don't you talk a little bit about what you're trying to share through that venue?
Yeah, so that's a kind of it's a variety of things that we share. Everything ranging from case studies, individual case studies of congregations that have gone through this work and or are currently going through this work, to perspectives from a number of different partners that we have, of all different faiths, there's a great Presbyterian minister that's here in the Triangle area who's written some series on the theology of faith-based housing from his Presbyterian perspective. We've had some folks from the Catholic world as well write articles that bring in a lot of the Catholic ideas as well. And so it's everything from theology to the case studies to talking about the history of faith-based housing and the Hafias and the almshouses, and then also legislation. There's a lot of legislation, kind of as an offshoot of the YIMBY movement. That it's kind of the YIGBY movement is what people call it. The yes in God's backyard. So there's been a lot of state and local legislation that's been going through, and also even a federal bill that's been introduced around YIGBY legislation. And so we also cover some of that as well. So really anything faith-based housing related is kind of on the docket for that Substack.
That's great. That's great. Well, Eli, what did we leave anything out today? Is there anything else that I should have asked you?
No, I think that probably just about covers it from me.
Great. So anybody trying to find you or learn more about this, I would imagine you first send them to your Substack. Is that right?
Yeah, that's probably the best place to start. It's fbhi.substack.com. And then you can also, we can put our website and some of my contact information in the show notes as well, so that people can find that.
Great. Great. Well, Eli, best of luck with all this. It's a really fascinating deal, and obviously a big need in a lot of places. So congratulate you on getting this started, and at such a young age. And so it's like you've got a lot of opportunity ahead of you, and I'm sure you'll find a lot of willing partners.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you so much for having me on.
No problem. All right. Eli Smith, everybody, take care.
Thanks so much.